was easy to get a bird's eye view whenever you wanted it. For example, when you're trying to find a theatre at Macquarie University. What you're seeing is footage from a small $2,000 drone, remotely piloted. Now I'm just looking around. There it is, that's what I'm looking for. So it's remotely controlled by me, but it has the capability of being completely autonomous, and it can probably fly far more effectively than I can control it. So let's see if we can get in through the doors. Obviously you can see the reflection of the drone on the footpath. Some spectators. We'll get there. Notice as I'm moving this around, it's completely stable. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So I want to talk about drones, or more accurately, unmanned aerial vehicles. Not these scarily named Predator and Reaper drones that the US Army or government uses to execute people it doesn't like, but more usefully, these type of drones. These things couldn't actually have existed 6 years ago, and certainly not at this price. So why are they now able to exist? This is what a gyroscope looked like in the 50s and 60s. Sorry. This is what it looks like today. It used to weigh about several kilos, about the size of a grapefruit. Now it fits onto a tiny computer chip that costs less than $10. And that's sitting inside a flight controller that you can buy for around $70 now. I'll talk a bit about that more later. So rather than talking about the technology, I think history remembers the ripples that technology creates. Before the car was a car, there was the horseless carriage. And it really didn't make an impact until there was the road infrastructure, which allowed freedom of movement, decentralized cities. It made a whole bunch of nomads in Saudi Arabia very, very rich and important to the global economy. So what are some of the ripples that drones are starting to create? First, we'll take a look at filmmaking. If you wanted to fly and get aerial footage of Sydney at the moment, you'd probably look at using something like this. It's a Cineflex camera positioned on the front of a helicopter. You need to hire the helicopter, the pilot, and it will run you at over $10,000 a day. And these are amazing. They're not going to go away anytime soon, but they're not really accessible to small independent filmmakers. So what would be possible if we could chop a zero off that cost? And this is the TBS Discovery Pro. It's what I flew in today. It costs about $2,500. It has a stabilizing gimbal for the camera, so that's how you get that very steady shot. And it also has what's known as first-person view, or FPV. So you can get a live view of what you're shooting. So not only can the pilot see where they are flying, but the cameraman can operate the camera independently and get the shot. So let's have a look at some very good pilots using this $2,500 quadcopter to get some amazing footage. Now these can fly where helicopters can't. They can get under things. They can fly indoors. Working on new technology that will allow this to happen automatically. So you wear a little transponder on your belt, and the copter through software knows to keep within 10 to 15 meters away from you. Always point the camera towards you while you go skiing, surfing, mountain biking, And as the software gets better, it'll avoid colliding with anything as well. It's pretty cool. This was not possible a couple of years ago. Now on to first responder and emergencies. This is a photo of a road getting washed away during the Colorado floods recently. The conditions then grounded all support aircraft, so they couldn't get the information from the air. And if you're a first responder trying to get through this road, you're out of luck. Despite no manned aircraft flying, a company called Falcon, who flies these UAVs, launched one of their fixed-wing drones and took hundreds of photos. And the next thing they did is really interesting. They, rather than just sharing individual photos, they stitched them all together and put them onto an interface that we're all familiar with, Google Maps. So you can pan, zoom, and access that information from a browser. But they actually went a little bit further. Within 3 hours of that drone going up, they processed hundreds of images, stitched them all together because it knew exactly where it took the photo and which orientation it was in, and uploaded 500 megabytes of high-resolution data to the internet so you can load it into something like Google Earth. And this is something I did just a couple of days ago. So I'm now zooming into the affected area. And I'm about to turn on. So let's see if the Pratt Parkway is accessible or not. That's an overlay with the live image. That's 3 hours after the drone was in the air. So okay, Pratt Parkway is a no-go. How about Main Street? That looks okay. Let's move on a little bit. Martin Street looks alright as well. Because it's in Google Maps, I can change the orientation to suit my purpose. So are there houses that are isolated? Are there businesses that need help? And you can see the dramatic difference. And this is accessible to anyone with an internet connection within 3 hours of that drone going up. We'll talk a little bit about open source hardware, because without it, none of these things would be possible, let alone at this price point. Now, a lot of us are familiar. Lockheed Martin is a military contractor who builds flight controllers and drones. So in the military world, they're very reliable, but they're very closed and very expensive. So it's $8,500 for the flight controller and in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for the drone. People see, before I get into open source hardware, let's talk a little bit about open source software, because we're fairly familiar with that. We use it every day. And I think a lot of people think of open source software like this guy. It's very nice, but how on earth does he make a living? Well, there's also this guy. And it turns out that when you add value to free, you've got very viable business models. So a couple of examples. Firefox signed a $1 billion deal with Google over 3 years to send the search queries to Google. And Google obviously has a very good revenue model, and they paid Firefox for it very handsomely for its development. Linux powers most of the internet that we enjoy, and it's a free operating system. But if you're a company, you need a bit more reliability. You need to be able to pick up the phone and send an email and have someone respond quickly. So premium support services from Red Hat Linux totaled $1.3 billion worth of revenue for that company alone last year. So there's enormous economic opportunity for free. So how does this look in the hardware space? In 2007, Chris Anderson, the editorial director for Wired magazine, got into drones, and he started a community called DIY Drones. This is what it looked like in 2007. And he invited people from all around the world to join him in hacking together, using Lego parts and bits and pieces, a flight controller. Today, just 6 years later, DIY Drones is a thriving community of 44,000 members. And not only did they hack together something, they iterated, produced an APM flight controller, and in fact the community demanded of Chris that he start a company, 3D Robotics, to actually manufacture these things that they'd collectively created and sell it to the community. So business was born organically out of an open free community, and it stays free. A lot of the designs are free. And just in the last couple of weeks, 3D Robotics raised $30 million in Series B financing to take this field forward. And The next flight controller is competing directly with that Lockheed Martin flight controller for $8,500. This one sells for $200. And the open source, the code is open source. You can modify it. You can see what's happening. Very, very different business models, and I think this is a bit more future-proof. Now, perhaps the killer application for drones is agriculture, and the farmers know this because they're in a razor-thin margin business, and their farms are getting larger and larger because they've been acquired, and unfortunately, they need to become a lot more efficient at allocating resources. So how do drones help? Today, there's already software that allows you to draw an area and will automatically plot lines and decide where to take photos to give you coverage of that land. So this is representing 120 hectares, and that's great and very useful. But when you can process that image, you can start to get some really interesting information out of it. And I'll go into that in just a second. The big application for this is, I think, the reduction in pesticides. Because we don't have, or farmers don't have really good information on a small level, they tend to blanket their crops with pesticides. It's very, very expensive. In fact, Australia spent $2.4 billion on pesticides in 2004. That's $100 for every man, woman and child every year. And it's probably increased in the last 10 years. So surely we can do better. Turns out we can, and agriculture is talked about as an application of drones, but there's a very specific aspect that wasn't obvious to me at all. It turns out that our eyes only see a tiny proportion of what's happening in the natural world, and that's because we can't see near infrared. If we could, we would see photosynthesis happening, because plants reflect, photosynthesis reflects near infrared. Now, near infrared cameras and technology has been traditionally very, very expensive, but again, the open source world is coming to our rescue, and there's a recently successfully funded Kickstarter project that makes it possible to modify standard webcams to be able to see near infrared, and of course hoist these into the air using a drone. And this is the sort of thing you get. The image on the left is a standard photograph. The image on the right is shot taking the slightly modified camera. Then you bring them together and process the highlights. So where is the photosynthesis happening a lot? And that's when you get the image on the right. So the green areas are very healthy growing plants. Now that might indicate weeds, it might indicate just healthy crops, but you can very clearly see where you need to allocate resources and perhaps certainly where you don't need pesticides anymore. So farming becomes an exercise in big data collection and analysis to make much, much better decisions. And at the end of the day, who here wouldn't buy an apple that had 50% or less pesticides? So of course, nothing's ever smooth, and we hear about drones primarily in the negative context. Whenever someone has a lapse in judgment, like a guy in Manhattan recently bouncing a $700 ready-to-fly copter from literally against the buildings in Manhattan, and our own Bright Spark in Sydney deciding it was a good idea to crash into the Harbour Bridge pylon the day before an international naval fleet review. So this is always going to happen, but I think one solution is, people are going to use technology for nefarious purposes, no matter what. And there's even an app to help you. There really is. It's called Ballistic Trajectory Planner. Right? So this is going to happen, but we can mitigate the risks quite effectively. One way is through regulation, and our Air Safety Authority, CASA, is actually leading the world in making it possible to use drones for commercial purposes. Most of the rest of the world, you're not allowed to. And they have a very risk-based approach and pragmatic approach to allowing us to see what's possible and potentially see, have the ripples come to fruition and make a big impact. The other thing that's not terribly obvious is that these are flying robots with very powerful processors. So it would be absolutely feasible to allow software to make the air safer. So government agencies can ring fence areas where they don't want you to fly unless you have special permission. And perhaps even better, they can ring fence safe to fly areas. So it guarantees that the craft doesn't leave that area and it doesn't do anything dangerous. And perhaps this can be motivated by, if you opt into this, you get liability insurance, or you get some other benefit. So it doesn't have to be heavy-handed. You must do this to learn something. And really excitingly, a lot of this technology is going to come back into the civil airspace to make flights safer. Human beings have an inbuilt delay between 80 and 200 milliseconds. It's a fifth of a second from when you can see something and possibly react. This senses its environment 400 times a second. So low altitude, high winds, I'd rather this control the plane. I still want the pilot there, but I'd rather this do the really fast stuff that we cannot. So just giving you a historical perspective and aligning it to the PC industry, which I was there for at the beginning, the similarities are amazing. So they both came out of the military application first, the mainframes in 63, and the drone was introduced in 95. We're just coming out of the 70s phase, where computers were a bit awkward. You had to piece together electronics yourself. The controller was not at all intuitive and quite cumbersome. Just a year later, we're starting to get these ready-to-fly drones that can be controlled with a tablet. It's equivalent to the IBM PC. Now, what hasn't happened yet is the Macintosh. We haven't produced a drone that is available for everyone to use, that is also safe to fly and won't collide and won't do anything bad. But that is coming. And then we've got another 30 years to get to the same point computers are at today, and we will have smartphones in our pocket. So the potential impact is huge because the technology is going to improve so much. So I'd like to encourage you to get started. You can buy a tiny little nano drone for $50 and it weighs less than 50 grams and it can't really hurt anything. For $200, you can buy a slightly larger one with a camera which will send a live video feed, kind of like this, to your controller. So the prices have completely collapsed on this. And if you're really keen, I'm starting up workshops teaching people how to go from parts to a drone that looks something like that. So hopefully you'll let your imaginations run with the possibilities rather than being influenced by the media sensationalistic sort of negative view of predator drones. Thank you very much.